A warm welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week on the program, has Ukraine escalated the war with Russia by using US and UK missiles? And will Russia make good its promise of attacking NATO countries if their weapons are used in the war between Russia and Ukraine? All this talk about use of nuclear weapons has Europe and NATO members a bit jittery. Even more is talk of the US withholding military aid to Ukraine. Now, according to President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine could lose the war if the US decides to stop aid to Ukraine. We'll be doing a wrap of Ukraine's renewed deal in the war and be discussing this with Head Division of International Politics and Senior Research Fellow at the Nigeria Institute of International Affairs, Dr. Nicholas Arame. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. Let's check in on other discussions in diplomatic circles, and we'll be right back. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has confirmed the arrest of Simon Ekpa by Finnish authorities on Thursday, November 21st, 2024. A statement from the ministry says the Finnish authorities alleged that the Nigerian-Finnish citizen and prominent leader of the proscribed indigenous people of Biafra used social media platforms to spread separatist propaganda, incite violence, and encourage illegal actions, which had caused significant disruptions in the southeast of Nigeria. It says that Finnish investigators had also linked Ekpa to incidents of violence in Nigeria, which were believed to have been fueled by his online activities, and that Ekpa's arrest followed sustained diplomatic pressure by the Nigerian government on Finland to take action against his activities. Ten pro-Palestinian NGOs have asked a Dutch court to stop the Netherlands exporting weapons to Israel and trading with Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territories, citing high civilian casualties in Israel's war in the Gaza Strip. According to the plaintiffs, the Dutch state, as a signatory to the 1948 Genocide Convention, has a duty to take all reasonable measures at its disposal to prevent genocide. Lawyer Wout Albers, acting for groups including Palestinian rights organizations, Al-Haq and Al-Mezen, and pro-Palestinian Jewish organization In Anders Judes Gelid, said the Netherlands had failed to take the measures needed by continuing its exports of weapons, parts, and military cooperation. Meanwhile, the German government says it will carefully examine the International Criminal Court's arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense chief Yoav Gallant, but will not take further steps until the visit to Germany is planned. German spokesperson Stefan Hebestreit said at a press conference, "We have made a statement that must fulfill both conditions we are talking about. On the one hand, this is the importance of the International Criminal Court, which we very much support, and on the other hand, the historical responsibility you mentioned, and the spokesman's statements should be seen within these two aspects. I could be tempted to say, I find it difficult to imagine that we would carry out arrests in Germany on this basis." The German government's position on weapons deliveries to Israel has not changed following the arrest warrants and are still subject to a case-by-case assessment. Finally, Romania and Bulgaria are set to become full members of Europe's borderless Schengen travel zone by January 2025, according to Hungary, adding a final decision would be made at next month's meeting of EU interior ministers. Romania and Bulgaria, both European Union and NATO members, partly joined Schengen in March after an agreement with Austria, which initially opposed their joining on the grounds they needed to do more to prevent illegal immigration. While air and maritime border checks between them and the other 27 countries in the travel zone were lifted, negotiations with Austria over land entry have continued through 2024.
Today, this very important agreement. And this will mean that hopefully, and I know that this is the aim of Minister Pinter, to have a decision in the December Council to lift the internal border controls at the land borders for Bulgaria and Romania. And I do hope that the date the Council could agree on should be the 1st of January. We have seen that Romania and Bulgaria have fulfilled all criteria and above. We see that the irregular arrivals to the European Union overall has gone down with 40% this year. For the Western Balkan routes, it's down with more than 80%. For the Bulgarian-Romanian external border, down 80%. And Gerard just mentioned this huge decrease towards Austria. And I think this is a proof of the good cooperation and the good measures that have been implemented.
Welcome back. NATO says it will not be deterred from helping Ukraine win the war with Russia despite the use of intercontinental ballistic missile against the country on Wednesday. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says a missile which looked very much like an ICBM was fired towards Dnipro in Ukraine. According to the U.S. Pentagon, the experimental intermediate-range ballistic missile was based on a Russian RS-26 Rubez missile, and that the U.S. was notified briefly before the launch. Also, that the U.S. had briefed Ukraine and other close allies and partners in recent days on Russia's possible use of such a weapon in order to help them prepare. Experts say the launch raises the prospects of nuclear weapons, IRBMs and ICBMs, which can both be equipped with nuclear warheads.
19 ноября 6 оперативно-тактическими ракетами ATACMS производства США.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has finally confirmed that Russia launched a hypersonic medium-range ballistic missile attack on a Ukrainian military facility and warned the West that Moscow could strike the military installations of any country whose weapons were used against Russia. The Russian president says the West is escalating the conflict in Ukraine by allowing Kyiv to strike Russia with long-range missiles, and that the conflict is becoming a global conflict. So Russia had conducted combat tests of the Oreshnik, the hypersonic missile system, in response to the aggressive actions of NATO countries against Russia. The Russian ICBM launched against Ukraine is the first time it's been used in the war. The powerful nuclear-capable weapon has a range of thousands of kilometers. It comes as Ukraine reportedly fired US ATACMS and British Storm Shadow cruise missiles at targets inside Russia during the week, despite warnings by Moscow that it will see such action as a major escalation in the 33-month-old war. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was first to point out Russia's latest move, even though it had not been confirmed by Russia. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova was phoned during a live briefing on Thursday and told not to comment on reports of the ICBMs. Russian Telegram channel says Russia had attacked what is known in Ukraine as the Missile and Space Rocket Company, which is headquartered in Dnipro. Kyiv's foreign ministry on Thursday urged the international community to react swiftly to Russia's recent launch. The spokesperson called on Ukraine's partners to take concrete actions to provide Ukraine with air defense systems capable of intercepting such weapons. The U.S. Pentagon said it had been pre-notified ahead of the Russian attack.
I can confirm that Russia did launch an experimental intermediate-range ballistic missile. This IRBM was based on Russia's RS-26 Rubez intercontinental ballistic missile model. In terms of notifications to the United States was pre-notified briefly before the launch through nuclear risk reduction channels.
Ukrainians say they are cautious as the Russian president has suggested more attacks on Ukraine with new ballistic missiles. People on the streets of Kyiv said on Friday that they are afraid and worried about further attacks following the use of Russia's new hypersonic missile on the central city of Dnipro. Some also say Putin's statements on further use of the missile should be taken just as seriously. But experts say a de-escalation is the most dangerous response to Russia.
A lot of people are calling this an escalation, but really this is just for psychological impact by President Putin. It's trying to deter the West and the backers of Ukraine from continuing to support Ukraine in the way they have done up until now. This is a weapon with very little military utility, and it's not even particularly useful for Russia's secondary aims of killing civilians in Ukraine and destroying their homes. Instead, it's a demonstration, and of course it's backed up with these threats by Putin that those countries helping Ukraine could find themselves targeted as well in the future. So really how this plays depends on how the West is going to respond to Putin's threats. De-escalation, as ever, would be the most dangerous possible response because it would show to Russia once again that these threats work and encourage more of them in the future.
It was a political signal, more so than a military one right away. Because we know that Russia informed shortly before the Americans about the fact that they would launch a weapon via the different channels they have through the nuclear risk reduction centers. And so it's clear that Putin wanted to show this is our red line. Don't go further. Don't deliver more weapons of similar categories to Ukraine and allowing them to strike our territory. So basically, I think he tried to escalate in a way to de-escalate, but we have to see whether this kind of Russian logic will work in the case of the war against Ukraine.
In the meantime, Ukraine is hoping for emergency talks with NATO this week that will lead to concrete and meaningful outcomes against Russia.
I want to bring in now Senior Research Fellow at the Nigeria Institute of International Affairs, who's also head of the Division of International Politics, also at the Institute, Dr. Nicholas Arame. Dr. Nicholas, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
What do you make of the new dimension in the war in Ukraine, what we've seen this week so far?
Yeah, I think that first, it's becoming interesting that Ukraine is actually speaking from both sides of the mouth about the conflict. On one hand, Ukraine is calling for an end to the conflict, and on the other hand, Ukraine is also launching missiles into Moscow, and again, also eliciting more violent response from Putin. And it shows that from what we are seeing, the pictures on ground, it does not seem to be an end in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And it is also a very worrisome dimension, particularly for the international system, given that the war itself has had a grave consequences on the global system already.
Well, Russia has reportedly launched an ICBM, that's according to the Ukrainian president. We now understand from the U.S. Pentagon that this is not an ICBM. It is an IRBM instead. That's an intermediate range ballistic missile. And it was fired sort of like as a warning to Ukraine. Do you see that as it is, the fact that, this could possibly be carrying nuclear warheads next time when Russia does launch a missile like this into Ukraine?
Yeah, you see, first, let me start by saying that anything that falls within the core contribute circles of nations, these are issues that actually make nations go to war. And these are not issues nations toy with. And much as the war has been going on, and the genesis of this issue about Ukraine membership of NATO or not to be, and going by the weapon that was shot into Moscow, Russia needed to show to not just Ukraine, that to the whole world, that it is in every way ready to fight any advances. And let's not also forget that Russia does not necessarily see this war as just against Ukraine. It sees the war that Ukraine has a lot of backers, or what I call supporters, right? And Russia is also fighting for the soul of its survivor. So I mean that they are beginning to use weapons and counter weapons. It shows that Russia is ready to go any length. And let's not forget that even though I've looked at in terms of the weapons, Russia's own seems to be more sophisticated because the whole issue of nuclear. And there's this fear, are we approaching the Third World War? Or is there likely going to be a Third World War? Or would Russia unleash that in Ukraine? But if you understand global politics very well, you see that apart from state-centric understanding of global politics, we also need to focus on the individuals. And Putin himself has not been somebody that has shied away from the fact that he is ready to do anything possible, to defend the integrity of Russia, including if it means, throwing as much nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And that has always been the case there. And even though Putin himself is a bit, not too keen about the war, I think Ukraine's effort, Ukraine's continuous attacks and support it has gotten from other parts of the world has ensured that Putin himself is on his toes on what happens between Russia and Ukraine.
European leaders are meeting right now to discuss the escalation of weapons use between Russia and Ukraine. So it's interesting, the US and the UK have given Ukraine the permission to use their long-range weapons, but here they are accusing Russia of using IRBMs and of using ICBMs, possible ICBMs as well, and the possibility of nuclear weapons being used in this war. What do you make of the inequality, in this condemnation that they seem to have for Russia and then not for Ukraine?
And let's not forget that international politics itself is characterized by national interests. It's characterized by power interests. It's characterized by nations themselves trying to ensure that they aggregate their interests. So within the context of this, you see that there has been a whole lot of gang up against Russia at the expense of Ukraine, right? So now, what are they expected the world powers to do was to bring both parties to ground, bring both parties to the negotiation table, condemning their acts collectively and repeatedly stating why both countries cannot in any way continue about that. And rather, they choose to go the path of condemning Russia, which itself, for me, I don't see how it's going to yield fruit, because since this conflict has started, you see that there have been several attempts, to sanction Russia by the UN Security Council, but all those attempts have been met with a brick wall. So this also itself, if it's all about condemning what Russia is doing and not holistically looking at what both parties, have done in the conflict and how we can resolve it, I can bet you for a fact that it's going to meet a brick wall too.
I wanted to talk about NATO's position in this because they seem to be non-committal. You have NATO countries that are seemingly pulling back now their support for Ukraine, and then you have NATO still saying, we're still going to meet with the US president, we're going to discuss, and then, whatever comes out of that, we're still behind Ukraine. Whether or not Russia continues to use the IRBMs or ICBMs, we're still supporting Ukraine. But what do you make of NATO's position here? And is it detrimental to Ukraine's success in this war?
Yeah, you see, in the heat of this crisis is the whole issue about NATO's expansion. Right? We must accept that as a fact, whether we like it or not. It is in the heat of NATO's expansion. Now, there is no way a world power will not be worried about who its immediate neighbor talks to or is interacting with. And it is within that context, Russia thinks that it is almost impossible for Ukraine to join NATO, because within core realism and within foreign policy calculations and national interests, if Ukraine joins NATO, it's only a matter of time, Russia will be attacked. And that itself, it's a known fact, not only to Russia, even to NATO members. So that NATO members are taking a divergent view from the way Putin sees the war is not unexpected, right? But I think that it is high time NATO also sit down and look at these issues side by side within the context of how nations behave within the international system, one, and to also look at it since this war has started, who appears to be on the winning side, who appears to be on the losing side. Then three, to also look at the humanitarian crisis that the war itself has brought about, one. Four, to also look at the global implications of this war currently, then to also look at the larger picture of what is likely going to come out if this situation persists. And that is why I think that it is in the interest of NATO, for now to step down whatever move they are making in in ensuring that Ukraine join NATO or whatever fact and whatever move they are doing in the conflict, rather to step back and sit down and allow both countries, Ukraine and Russia, find a midpoint to ending this conflict.
Dr. Nicholas Arame, thank you so much for speaking with us on Diplomatic Channel.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here.
For nearly 2 weeks, more than 65,000 delegates have been attending the International Climate Summit in Baku, Azerbaijan, seeking a deal on climate financing to support the clean energy transition in developing countries. And on Friday, they drafted a proposal to rich countries to pay $250 billion per year to help poor nations, a proposal that drew criticism from all sides.
The proposal for $250 billion per year to poorer nations by the year 2035 was put before world governments at the summit in Baku, tasked with agreeing with a sweeping funding plan to tackle climate change. But the talks have been marked by division between wealthy governments resisting the costly outcome and developing nations pushing for more.
Yeah, $250 billion is not what's needed in the context of clear agreement that we need $1.3 trillion for the developing country share of external finance. But it's a start. The question is there a credible pathway to build on that towards the $1.3 trillion by 2035? If there's not, and this is the final answer, it's not going to be acceptable to developing countries.
One European negotiator says the due draft deal is too expensive and does not do enough to expand the number of countries contributing to the funding. Governments that will be expected to lead the financing include the European Union, Australia, the United States, Britain, Japan, Norway, Canada, New Zealand, and Switzerland. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who addressed the summit on Thursday, said delegates have to soften lines and compromise to reach a deal.
From now on, what matters is not what was the initial position of each party. What now matters is how to find a compromise that allows for an ambitious result in relation to the new global goal, because finance is in the center of this COP, but at the same time to take into account the concerns of all other countries in relation to the different aspects that are relevant for the future of our battle against climate change.
A published draft text on Thursday regarding how much money richer countries should provide poorer ones to help them tackle climate change was received with mixed reactions. Developing countries need at least $1 trillion annually by the end of the decade to cope with climate change, according to economists. The 10-page draft agreement on Thursday summed up the opposing positions of developed and developing nations established before the event. One proposal, reflecting the views of the bloc of developing countries, focused on ensuring the funds were grants or grant equivalent in form, and that contributions from developing countries to each other, a nod to large potential donors such as China, were not formally part of the target.
2/3 of climate finance are loans that are adding to our debt burden, and it's not fair because there are already 60 countries highly indebted that are highly vulnerable to climate change, and the historical climate debtors are making profit of these loans as they receive the interest repayment and everything. So now there is an acknowledgement of that this money needs to be at least 50% grant-based finance. We are asking and demanding public finance to be in the heart of this goal.
A draft released by late Friday afternoon called on all actors to work together to enable the scaling up of financing to developing country parties for climate action from all public and private sources to at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. It also says, in this context, goal and extension of the goal referred to in the document with developed countries taking the lead to $250 billion per year by the year 2035 for developing country parties for climate action. Later, COP29 presidency lead negotiator Yalchin Refiev said,
As you know, since the beginning of this year, Azerbaijan COP29 presidency has been pushing for a more fair and ambitious outcome of the COP29, the fair, ambitious NCQG that takes into account needs and priorities of the developing country parties. Today we have published a streamlined package of the draft decisions, and that includes also a $250 billion goal by the developed countries. We will continue to work with the parties to make the final adjustments to those issues that are still outstanding, and we will try to make sure that, and we are committed to make sure that this COP has the most ambitious outcome by pushing all the parties to get there.
Thank you very much, and I now give the floor to Mexico.
Hence, negotiations continued on Friday. On the sidelines of the conference, Mexico announced a transition to net zero by 2050 at COP29.
Mexico will be updating its NDC next year and increase its ambition. We're also planning to move towards a more credible target, more clear one, potentially one that is expressed in absolute economy-wide reduction targets that translate into specific carbon budgets per sector, allowing for much greater accountability on compliance.
Countries are required to submit NDCs by February 2025 that describes their 1.5C aligned emissions slashing targets for 2035 with economy-wide targets that cover all greenhouse gases, including methane.
Okay, so my mother was environment minister.
This is where we end the program this week. Do you think Ukraine should come to a compromise with Russia on ending the war? Let me know your thoughts either on social media or in the comment section below this video on YouTube. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.